The Greek writer Herodotus, known as the father of modern history, described Egypt as a gift of the Nile, referencing the buildup of the land via river deposits, but also the climate and fertility the river provided that made Egypt such a paradise. The Nile River is the longest river on Earth. The whole 4,258-mile length is comprised of the White Nile and the Blue Nile and flows through 11 nations, including Egypt. Viewed from above, the river is a wide ribbon of blue and green parting vast expanses of arid brown. Every year, tropical rains beginning in July cause the Nile to flood, and in ancient times overflow into the surrounding land. When the water receded, it left behind thick, black, fertile soil it had gathered throughout its length. This allowed Egyptians to farm and raise livestock very successfully, whereas beyond the Nile's floodplain, lack of rainfall made this very difficult. The difference in soil was so apparent that the ancient name of the land around the Nile was Kemet, meaning black land. Even in ancient times, Egyptians took steps to manage the floodwaters of the life-giving river. They built canals and earthen dams to contain and direct the water as needed. In recent years, the construction of the Aswan Dam, an engineering marvel in its own right, has brought the river under control. In order for the dam to be constructed, engineers relocated the ancient temple of Abu Simbel. The temple was recorded and deconstructed carefully and then reassembled piece by piece on higher ground. The relocation project took 4 years to complete and gave archaeologists and engineers a unique perspective on the construction techniques used by ancient builders. In order to have successful farming seasons, ancient Egyptians needed to keep track of when the Nile was expected to flood and recede. Crops were planted as soon as the waters receded and had to be harvested before the next flood. To do this, they developed a calendar that was based on a 365-day year broken into 12 months. This calendar led to organization and documentation similar to that we still use today. The Egyptian calendar was based on relationships between the sun and the moon and the flooding of the Nile. There were 3 seasons in an ancient Egyptian year: inundation, growth, and harvest, so here too we see the strong influence of the river on Egyptian daily life. The Nile winds through the recurring cycles of nature and the people's abstract concept of time. Another gift the Nile provided were the papyrus reeds that grew along its banks. Egyptians used these reeds to create a durable, beautiful writing surface with which to record details of their calendar, their grain supply, their sacrifices to the gods, and the tribute collected from the people and from other nations. Fibers from the papyrus plants were soaked and woven together into sheets, which were dried, pressed, and polished. The sheets could be combined into longer documents in the form of scrolls. In the dry Egyptian climate, these scrolls preserved well. Archaeologists have discovered papyrus scrolls that date to 2550 BCE that are still legible. The comparative abundance of written material that has survived the millennia via these papyrus scrolls is a gift to modern historians as well. The Great River also provided transport between the flourishing cities and sites along its banks. Thebes, Luxor, Karnak, Amarna, Memphis, and Cairo. These are legendary names from ancient times and namesakes of flourishing modern cities today. Produce, livestock, workers, building materials, all could be carried on the current or with the wind for the length of the river. This easy means of travel allowed for trade flow between cities, integrating the culture. The Nile Delta is the land at the mouth of the river, where it drains into the Mediterranean Sea. Because the silt of the river is continuously deposited, the land here is constantly changing, shifting in its own way as inexorably as the surrounding desert sands. Based on records that exist from ancient times, we know the delta, at one time, had 7 distributaries, where it now has 2. It is possible using satellite images to reconstruct some of the routes of the 5 vanished rivers and visualize how changed this land has been since ancient times. There are many archaeological sites in and around the delta area, including the city of Tanis, which was recently discovered to have been lost and buried by the drift in the river location. The city of Heracleion was once the flourishing port on the Mediterranean at the mouth of the Nile. Goods from Phoenicia, Greece, and then Rome passed through the city during its day. The ruins of the city were recently discovered on the sea floor, miles off the Egyptian coast. It is now believed that the city was drowned in an earthquake event that undermined the city's foundations. The state of preservation and the abundance of artifacts in this submerged city have provided a greater understanding of life at the time it sank. Most notably, the harbor contains the remains of the ships that were in port and is the largest collection of ancient ships that has ever been discovered. The ships were so recently uncovered that it will be years before they are excavated, examined, and interpreted, but the find is expected to rewrite our ideas about naval history and capability. The obviously unstable quality of this area is only exacerbated by the slow migration of the Nile from east to west. This restructuring of the terrain has been pointed to as a means of dating the structures on the Giza Plateau using geologic evidence. If it is assumed that the river ran directly past the causeways of the pyramids when they were originally built, the time it took the river to arrive at its current location suggests the pyramids were built thousands of years ago, and arguably thousands of years earlier than the accepted chronology. One more instance in which the history of Egypt is slowly being uncovered. The body is the house of God. Man, know thyself, and thou shalt know the gods. Ancient Egyptian proverb. Egyptian culture envisioned the beginning of existence as chaos and darkness. The force of chaos was embodied by the god Apophis and is the natural enemy of Maat, the goddess of order. Husband and wife, as well as brother and sister, Isis and Osiris were primary gods in the Egyptian pantheon, along with their dark and brooding brother, Set. It was Set's betrayal and murder of Osiris that led to Isis's quest to revive the dead god. When the god Anubis helped Isis ritually prepare the corpse of Osiris, it is thought the art of mummification was inspired. Osiris was brought back to life for long enough that Isis was able to conceive their son, Horus. This resurrection also cast Osiris as the Lord of the Dead, and Isis as the mother goddess in Egyptian spiritual beliefs. It is interesting that the Egyptians portrayed their gods in multiple forms, many of which involved animal characteristics, or manifestation in purely animal form. Thoth is the ibis-headed god of wisdom, who also manifested in the form of a baboon. Anubis is the jackal-headed guardian of the dead, who sometimes appears as a crouching dog. Hathor is sometimes depicted as a cow and sometimes as a beautiful woman, the goddess of love. Bastet is the cat goddess of home, fertility, and childbirth. Cats were worshipped in ancient Egypt as Bastet's servants, or as manifestations of the goddess herself. Perhaps the most bizarre and frightening was Ammit, the soul eater. She had the jaws of the crocodile, and a body part lion and part hippopotamus. The king of the gods was Amun-Ra, represented as the sun. He was the special protector of the city of Thebes. The Temple of Karnak, dedicated to Amun-Ra, is a vast complex of temple buildings that were erected beginning in the Middle Kingdom era. Monuments continued to be erected through the end of the Ptolemaic period, giving a wide span of architectural styles and patterns in religious belief. Throughout the long period of their worship, the Egyptian gods did face a few challenges to their power. In the years 1344 through 1328 BCE, Egypt was ruled by Pharaoh Akhenaten. Before the 5th year of his reign, the pharaoh was known as Amenhotep IV. He changed his name at the same time he changed Egyptian religion and society. Instead of honoring the pantheon of Egyptian gods whose worship had long been a foundation of Egyptian life and the pharaoh's duty, Akhenaten declared that there was only one god. His new chosen name meant effective for Aten. The sun disk Aten was now the official god of Egypt. Akhenaten created a new capital city at Amarna, where the worship of Aten would be central, with massive temples that rivaled those of any deity in Egypt. In fact, Akhenaten officially disbanded the priesthood of all other gods, and the income of their cults was used to glorify Aten and the Aten cult. Of course, the pharaoh and his wife, Nefertiti, were high priest and priestess of this new religion, and soon took on a divine position themselves. Inscriptions all over Egypt that praised other gods were removed and monuments defaced. Along with the change to Aten worship, depictions of the royal family during this period are a striking departure from previous Egyptian style. Family scenes are more intimate than was seen previously. The portrayal of Akhenaten and Nefertiti are thought to be more naturalistic, but also exaggerated. Statues and paintings of Akhenaten are instantly recognizable with his distinct androgynous features. The queen also is widely recognized as an ideal of feminine beauty. Copies of a bust discovered in Amarna can be seen all around the world in art and women's jewelry. The fact that Akhenaten and Nefertiti remain such recognizable icons of Egyptian history is all the more striking because of the efforts made by later rulers to erase them and their new faith from existence. The priests of the powerful sun god, Ra, who had been the foremost god for most of history, had been displaced and demoted by Akhenaten's radical religious reforms. They were eager to put their divine patron back in power. Carvings depicting Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti have been discovered with the faces chiseled away. Inscriptions referencing them have been obliterated. Even the mummified remains scholars have identified as that of Akhenaten was discovered in a sarcophagus with the lower part of the face purposefully destroyed in antiquity. When Akhenaten, or the time of his reign, are mentioned in later inscriptions, he is only referred to as the heretic. Scholars believe that Akhenaten died in the 17th year of his reign, but the circumstances surrounding his death are unknown. It is also very unclear how the succession was handled after his death. Various figures come into play, including an unknown female pharaoh and the possibility that Nefertiti may have reigned disguised as a man. In any case, Akhenaten's young son Tutankhamun came to power and ruled with his regent, Ai. The boy king changed his name to Tutankhamun to distance himself from his father's unpopular cult of the Aten and reaffirm his loyalty to the god Amun. He ruled for only 10 years before he died suddenly. After his death, Tutankhamun's name was erased from official history by later rulers along with those of his mother and father. However, the discovery of his tomb and the exquisite golden sarcophagus have made King Tut the most well-known of all the pharaohs of Egypt. The next challenge to the supremacy of the ancient Egyptian gods came with the beliefs of a nomadic group who came to Egypt during a famine. The Hebrew refugees were welcomed, and their strange single god was respected insofar as his Hebrew servant Joseph had been able to interpret the pharaoh's troubling dreams. When Joseph was also able to predict a drought and save Egypt from famine accurately, he was rewarded and became a respected member of the court. It was not long, however, before the two faiths came into conflict. Arguably one of the most famous passages in the Bible is the story of Moses and the Pharaoh of Egypt. When the Pharaoh claims the Israelites as slaves and refuses to allow them to leave Egypt, the Hebrew God performs a number of miracles to force Pharaoh to let them go. The contrast and contest between the monotheistic Hebrew faith and the polytheism of the Egyptians could not be more explicitly described. At first, Moses is dared to conquer challenges that the Egyptian magicians are also able to accomplish. This escalates into a series of plagues on the Egyptians until the Hebrew cause is victorious after the death of the Egyptian firstborn. This story is the inspiration for the holiday of Passover, celebrating God sparing the Israelites the fate destined for the Egyptians. This section of the Bible is much debated by modern scholars. The pharaoh of the story has long been thought to have been Ramses the Great. Archaeological evidence supporting the occurrences described in the Bible has been scarce. Some theorists suggest a shift in dating provides a new wealth of evidence that has yet to be interpreted. It is hoped this new evidence may provide information about the story of the exodus of the Hebrew people from Egypt. Egypt today is predominantly Muslim, with approximately 20% of the population identifying as Coptic Christian. The old gods of ancient Egypt are considered mere myth and legend, in spite of the representations that can be seen in forms both large and small throughout the country. Regardless of the passage of time and the shifts in belief, religion has long played a vital role in Egypt's history and culture. O Great One, go in and say to the writer of the scripts, the guardian of the door of Osiris, that I am come, blessed and as a divine being to save my own soul. Egyptian Book of the Dead. The written pictograph language of Egypt is known as hieroglyphics. The word is from the Greek description, meaning sacred engravings. For much of modern history, it was assumed that these strange symbols were writing, but the meanings could only be guessed at by viewers. It was not until after the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and years of study that the modern world was able to decipher the messages left by the ancient Egyptians. The stone was discovered in 1799 by Napoleon's troops as they made their way through Egypt. The stone is inscribed with a pharaonic decree that is written in Greek, the Demotic Egyptian script, and hieroglyphs. Because the Greek language and the Demotic were already understood, scholars now had a reference to decipher the hieroglyphic symbols. After years of dedicated study and comparison to many examples of Egyptian text, Jean-François Champollion was able to decipher the hieroglyphic alphabet in 1822. Nearly 200 years later, new research has suggested that the hieroglyphs have a deeper meaning than a mere alphabet can encompass. That each symbol is a sentence unto itself, as well as an indicator of sound. This idea suggests interpreting hieroglyphs is similar to reading a modern acronym. For example, to an English speaker, the individual letters in an acronym like FYI also convey the extended phrase, "for your information." What deeper meaning might be revealed by a more thorough understanding of hieroglyphic writing? As with many things in Egypt, layers of meaning lie beneath the surface, and secrets still remain buried after thousands of years. Even in ancient Egypt, there were comparatively few people who could read and write these hieroglyphic texts. Those who could were known as scribes. Scribes recorded everything in ancient Egypt. We have found proclamations, edicts, laws, letters, treaties, spells, histories, and medical and religious texts that were all created by scribes. It is probable, given some clues in the language of written correspondence, that the scribes were also the ones who read aloud what had been written. It took a great deal of study and training to become a scribe, so they were a small portion of society. A scribe's education would have taken 4 to 5 years. At a time when average life expectancy was 40 years, this was an even greater dedication. It is believed that those trained as healers and midwives were also often taught to read and write so they could read medical documents and record information about a patient's health. Most scribes inherited their positions, so there were families who trained for this profession for generations. The majority of those who could read and write were men, but women did also occasionally learn as well. The skills of the scribe were so highly valued by Egyptian society that they were considered a part of the aristocracy. They also were not required to perform manual labor for community projects, as most citizens were. Although we have thousands of examples of hieroglyphic writing, the collection of the most famous texts from ancient Egypt is known to us in modern times as the Book of the Dead. Ancient Egyptians would have known these texts as spells for going forth by day. It has been said that the ancient Egyptians were obsessed with death. This impression is strengthened because the spells do contain instructions of a sort that are meant to assist a soul in traveling to the afterlife in safety. The spells provide directions, passwords, and advice for passing the tests that would need to be faced in order to reach their goal of eternal life. As the final test, the soul was thought to be called before the gods Osiris, Thoth, and Anubis to be judged. The person's heart would be weighed and balanced against the weight of a feather. If the heart was heavier than the feather, thanks to the weight of evil thoughts and deeds, then the soul would be devoured by the goddess Amit, who had the jaws of a crocodile. If the heart was lighter than the feather, it would be free to continue to paradise and everlasting life. Later representations of this ceremony represent the god Horus holding the scale to favor the soul being judged, implying the judgment could be influenced. Possibly this was arranged by the purchase of religious effigies, or shabti dolls, that were buried with the dead. These magic books were only used by royalty in the Old Kingdom, but soon anyone who could afford to have one would have it buried with them, often in the form of artwork covering tomb walls. This practice has resulted in a fascinating variety of books of the dead surviving to the modern era. An even more notable part of the Egyptian funeral process was the tradition of mummification. Priests practiced in the art took charge of a body after death. They first removed the internal organs. The brain was removed through the nostril. The body cavity was then filled with salt, sand, and sacred herbs to dry out the skin. The heart was left intact and in place, as ancient Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of the soul, or Ka. The other organs were preserved and stored in special canopic jars that would be buried alongside the sarcophagus. After a month or more of drying, the body would be treated with holy oils and wrapped in layers of linen bandages. Often, sacred talismans of precious metals and jewels were woven into the wrappings. Scarabs carved of gold and jewels were often wound throughout the bandages. Finally, the mummy was coated with oils and resins to seal and protect it. This treatment of the bodies of the dead preserved them to the extent that we can still see the faces of the ancient pharaohs thousands of years after their deaths. In recent years, scientists have even been able to reconstruct the DNA of Egyptian mummies from tissue that was mummified 3,000 years ago. Genetic testing has been used to confirm familial relationships between royal mummies, giving us more reliable identification of the remains and confirming parentage. Mummification was such an important part of Egyptian culture that even animals were mummified. It seems this was done to honor the animal or the god associated with it. Mummified animals were given as offerings to the gods and also included with personal grave goods, perhaps as servants or companions for the afterlife. It was believed that the mummified animal would act as a messenger between the supplicant and the god. With such a useful purpose, animals were mummified and given as gifts to the gods on a grand scale. The catacombs of Anubis at Saqqara alone contained the mummified remains of millions of dogs, foxes, and jackals, and there were many similar chambers housing mummified animals of all types around ancient Egypt. Although sanctuaries dedicated to the mummies of cats were popular, mummies of monkeys, mongoose, fish, and even crocodiles have also been found. The apparent demand for mummified animals was such that Egyptologists theorize animals were specifically bred for this purpose, creating a thriving industry. Animal mummies have also been discovered, upon X-ray examination, to hold only a few bone fragments rather than an entire animal. The stuffing material was wrapped and sculpted in the shape of the animal represented. One interpretation of these finds is that the sellers of animal mummies cheated their clients to save on material costs. Another way of viewing this is that the representation and the identification of the animal were sufficient to the goal of mummification in ancient Egyptian beliefs. Symbolism and symbolic magic such as this were common in Egyptian writing and religion. Pharaohs and other members of the elite class were laid to rest after mummification in an ornate coffin called a sarcophagus. The sarcophagus often featured an exterior carved, painted, or inlaid to look like a portrait of the deceased person. They were also often adorned with gold and jewels. The portraits in these death masks were thought to help the soul of the deceased recognize the physical body. It was believed the soul would reunite in some way with the body, which was of great importance to the journey in the afterlife. Destroying the face on the sarcophagus or the mummy was thought to cause the soul to be lost for all eternity. This was often done to punish the dead person by their enemies in life. The sarcophagus of Tutankhamun is an icon of Egyptian history and is perhaps the greatest treasure found in his tomb, the face of the long-dead boy king brought to life in shining gold. The entire burial ritual was meant to ensure the soul's immortality. Unfortunately, the tradition of burying a deceased person's earthly goods in their tomb, along with the precious sacred ornaments that were part of the mummy itself, was also an irresistible temptation to grave robbers. The vast majority of tombs that have been discovered in Egypt have been robbed and even purposefully desecrated at some point in the ages past. Many, it is believed, were emptied of grave goods in ancient times by the very workers who built and sealed the tomb. The tapering pyramid, the Egyptians' pride and wonder of the world, whose spiky top has wounded the thick cloud. Robert Blair. The Great Pyramid of Giza was one of the heralded 7 wonders of the ancient world, in company with the Colossus at Rhodes, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the statue of Zeus at Olympus, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the Pharos Lighthouse at Alexandria, and the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus. All of the wonders were amazing feats of early engineering, the like of which will not be seen again, and all but one is gone. The Great Pyramid is the only one of the ancient wonders that have survived to modern times, and even it has not passed the centuries unscathed. The limestone casing that used to shine bright white has long since fallen away or been robbed away for use in other construction. Although the Great Pyramid, also known as the Pyramid of Khufu, is the largest and most famous, Two other pyramids stand nearby on the Giza Plateau. The Great Sphinx also stands guard close by. There are somewhere around 120 identified pyramids known in Egypt, but there are certainly more that have yet to be uncovered. With the availability of satellite images, many pyramids have been discovered recently based on the visible impact on the landscape. These remain mysterious shapes in the sand until excavations can take place. Of the known pyramids, there are many different construction styles believed to have evolved through the thousands of years during which pyramids were built. They are also preserved in very different states. Some structures identified as having been ancient pyramids are now nothing more than stone rubble foundations. It is believed the first pyramid in Egypt was built around 2630 BCE near Saqqara. Since 2950 BCE, it had been a custom for prestigious burials to have a mastaba tomb, a flat, rectangular structure built to contain the burial. When the mastaba was being built for Pharaoh Djoser, a priest and healer in his court was the architect of the sacred space. The architect's name was Imhotep. Imhotep designed a structure in which the traditional rectangular shape of the mastaba was changed to a square. After the first square had been built, another smaller square level was added on top. This strategy was continued until the structure had risen to 6 levels, sequentially smaller and angled slightly inward to control the distribution of the massive amount of weight. The end result appears as a 4-sided staircase culminating in a flat top. Because of its appearance, and perhaps the step-by-step manner of construction, Imhotep's revolutionary building is known as the Step Pyramid and gives its name to all pyramids built in this design. When the Step Pyramid was completed, it was the highest construction on Earth at 203 feet high. The base of the structure was 358 by 410 feet. The entire pyramid was cased with polished white limestone to finish the exterior. Erosion and stone robbing have taken their toll on the pyramid, and the casing stones are no longer there. But the pyramid is still an impressive structure even in its aged state. Imhotep quickly became a favorite of Pharaoh Djoser. His name and titles are inscribed on a monument near the Step Pyramid, along with that of the pharaoh himself, an honor rarely given to Egyptians who were not royalty. Imhotep was not only a brilliant architect. It appears he was also a healer of great renown during his life. Archaeological evidence, including surgical tools, medical texts, herbal recipes, and, most importantly, human remains, prove that the ancient healers were working with surprising skill, knowledge, and success. Skeletal remains have been excavated that show broken bones that had been splinted and healed. Skulls have even been found that show indications of successful early brain surgery. Imhotep was credited, even in ancient times, for many advancements in medical treatments. Centuries after his death, Egyptians elevated him to the role of a god of wisdom and medicine. He was often identified in later years with the Greek god of healing, Asclepius. Imhotep is also a foundational figure in the tradition of the Masonic societies. Freemasons utilize many fundamentals of Egyptian mysticism in their rites and ceremonies. The symbolism of Egypt is a strong presence in the iconography of the Freemasons. The influence of Freemasonry and Egyptian mysticism on Reformation thinkers can be seen in the unfinished pyramid on the Great Seal of the United States of America. In an interesting modern resurrection, the name Imhotep is the one given to the titular hero in a series of movies first filmed in 1932. In The Mummy, the main character is an ancient Egyptian priest, magician, and healer who finds a way to come back to life thousands of years after his death and mummification. The real Imhotep's titles and reputation made him a good inspiration for this powerful movie wizard. The most recent movie in the series, The Mummy Returns, was released in 2001. It would seem that Imhotep's fame continues to grow even after 4,000 years.